When did the Roman Empire come to an end? Well, some might say that it ended with the sack of Rome by the barbarian nations in 476. Some might say it's later, when the capital of the Eastern Roman Empire, Constantinople, was seized by the Ottomans in 1453. It might go even more recently to 1806, when Napoleon ends the Holy Roman Empire. But it might be more accurate, and I might suggest that actually the Roman Empire never really comes to an end. Its influence and its legacy continues in the nations today, many of whom claim Rome as either their inheritance or their inspiration. We can think of the nations of Europe today. We can think of Russia, and of course, the Roman Catholic Church. So it's fair to say we'll cover a fair bit of history, and in doing that, one idea of studying history is that we can understand it best when we look at two forces clashing against each other. And that clash creates a new reality. Just think of events from history. Think of the Cold War. Two sides came against each other, and that clash created the world order we have today. Think about the civil rights struggle in America. That created a new America. And in God's view of history, there's a similar clash going on. And this clash is between these two very different forces, the forces of Zion and the forces of Rome, or as we might call it, Babylon, thinking back to last week. And that clash that's going to come between these two civilizations, these two ways of life, is going to create a new reality in which the kingdom of God is going to be established on the earth. So this is God's view of history. This is the clash that God is looking at in history, and what we're going to focus on then in this talk. And Rome is this great enemy in the Bible because in many ways it is the ultimate expression of the kingdoms of men. Everything we've looked at so far is symbolized in Rome. It was an empire of limitless ambition, of pride, and of greed. It didn't worship God. It trusted in superstitions and its own might. And like its predecessor, its spiritual predecessor, Babel, it wanted to be all-encompassing, to reach as far as possible into the heavens, and for its emperors to be gods on the earth. And Rome would also clash with God's people, the Jewish people who it would rule over for hundreds of years. And so we see this big clash, this big difference between the Roman world on the one hand and the Jewish world on the other hand. The former taking its ideas from the hearts of man and men's desires, and the latter taking its ideas from the wisdom of God. Rome, of course, was this universal power. It believed that it could encompass everything, all people, all cultures, and all religions. It was to be this universal city, where we get that word cosmopolitan from, a city where everyone could be part of it as long as they were under the rule of Rome and acknowledging its supremacy. The Jewish religion was very different. It was particularistic, almost nationalist in a sense, focused on one small group of people, trying to stay separate from the rest of the world, to not mix. The Romans, of course, glorified in their success. They worshipped great men, while the Jewish religion saw the poor and humble as being blessed by God, a complete inversion of the Roman way of life in the ancient world. The Romans were extremely superstitious, while the Jewish world encouraged obedience to the law and trust in God. So it's fitting then that the empire which stands up against Jesus in the latter days is going to be Roman in its nature. It is that totality of human pride and strength. Now, if we go back into the Bible, and if you want to open where we are, you might already be there in Deuteronomy 28, Israel was warned of Rome very far back. Deuteronomy 28, verse 39. As a consequence for Israel's unfaithfulness, they were told, weren't they? The Lord will bring a nation against you from afar, from the end of the earth, as swift as the eagle flies, a nation whose tongue you will not understand. And we know, of course, that the Romans, from the opposite side of the Mediterranean, from the west, all the previous kingdoms we looked at so far are quite similar to Israel in terms of where they were geographically and even linguistically in some ways. Think about the Assyrians. Rome's very, very different. It's from the end of the earth, the other side of the known earth, to the north, to the west. And we also have a description here of Rome being like an eagle. And the eagle, of course, is the number one identifying feature for Rome, used on all their standards we saw from the first slide, in all their official symbols and heraldry. Obviously, many nations like to use the eagle today, America, the American eagle, Russia, Germany. But Rome is the most recognized state to be associated with the eagle standard. And many of those nations which use the eagle are doing it in homage to Rome. We've learned also from that quote that they speak a very different language, a tongue that you will not understand. And the Romans did speak a completely different language, Latin. And you've probably heard it said before that Latin is one of the most different languages you can find from Hebrew. It's in a completely different language family, different vocabulary and alphabet. We're also told, and this is really interesting to note, that it's an empire based on force. If you read verse 50, a nation of fierce countenance, which shall not regard the person of the old, nor show favour to the young. And if we read historical accounts, we can see that from its very inception, Rome was a society predicated on violence and force. Well, why was that? Why did it start in such a violent way? Why is it from its very beginning, from its very end, been based on violence? Well, if we look at the Italian peninsula, this is according to historical accounts, there's no obvious centre of power. You might think about Egypt, where there's a river where a centre of power is established. There's a stronghold. In the UK too, we have a capital in London where there's a river. It's on the basis of trade, looking out in the direction of trade. But Italy doesn't have that natural centre of power, the peninsula. And so the only way to establish a central power, a strong force in Italy, was through force. There was no common ethnicity or culture that united the Italian people. And so again, the dominant power in Italy could not appeal to any kind of cultural unity. And so the power that would come to dominate the Italian peninsula would be the one which was the most violent, the one willing to use force the most effectively. And so the early years of the city of Rome are filled with these accounts of violence, of war and aggression against its neighbours. Just read some of the horrific acts they did against their neighbours. And the early years of the Republic, the Roman Republic, would be based on this constant military expansion. And it's summarized quite well by Hegel. He says, the Roman state rests geographically as well as historically on the aspect of violence. So this is a nation of fierce countenance indeed. We then see later in Deuteronomy 28 indications of the evil acts that Rome is going to commit against the Jewish people, including the destruction of Jerusalem and the temple, AD 70. We read in verse 52, and he shall besiege thee in all thy gates until thy high and fenced walls come down, wherein thou trustest, throughout all the land, and he shall besiege thee in all thy gates, throughout the land, which the Lord thy God hath given thee. And you can see there behind me the Arch of Titus showing the Roman destruction of Jerusalem, the carrying away of its spoils. And you might have seen this as well, that on October the 7th, they sort of pasted in memorial to the victims the Israeli flag over it. I thought that was quite ironic to have the Israeli flag next to a symbol of sort of Jewish destruction. The next moment in the Bible that we hear about Rome is, of course, Nebuchadnezzar's image, the most famous, Daniel chapter 2, and in the fourth beast of Daniel 7, and they sort of parallel each other, don't they? And we find Rome to be described as a kingdom of iron. It's obviously following on from the two empires of Persia and Greece, who we sort of jumped over in our study, but they are important. And the iron then represents the strength and might of its armies, the armies, of course, which would go on to conquer the world. And the fourth beast in Daniel chapter 7 also describes this nation with a similarly iron nature. We read, don't we, that it's dreadful and terrible, strong exceedingly, with great iron teeth. And we read that it breaks everything into pieces before it, that it's different from all the other beasts. So Rome is presented as this uniquely terrifying and powerful force in history. It's also interesting to note that the first two kingdoms mentioned in Nebuchadnezzar's image, and the ones we've looked at so far, are really Eastern empires ruling over the West. And now we suddenly see this sort of change where there are now Western empires, Western-based empires ruling over the East, so both Greece and Rome, and now the West sort of takes a preeminence in that region. And in a sense, power sort of keeps shifting further west. If you go into the future, over into sort of Europe, over into Britain, over into America, and it just keeps, there's a sort of trend of things going further west in history. Okay, so they will now have the power, they will have the dominance, the Western forces will have the dominance over Israel from this point forwards. I'm not going to do a whole history of Rome, you'll be glad to know, but we'll just talk about the stages of the history of Rome briefly. So the city had its legendary founding, of course, Remus and Romulus, apparently raised by wolves, as far back as 753 BC. And it started as a kingdom, a Roman kingdom. The first polity of Rome was kingship. And it was an unstable period. There were assassinations of many of the kings. The kings were hated, in many cases, by the people. They would often take advantage of their power. They'd be corrupt. And that would lead to the end of the kingdom and the establishment of a republic. Obviously quite early for a republic. We're used to republics today. Most nations in the world are republics, the vast majority, but this is quite an early republic being formed. And Rome in this period was led by a series of sort of semi-elected consuls. It was governed over by a senate where there was kind of a semblance of democracy. So it was a little bit democratic. But the senate would consist mainly of very wealthy aristocrats. And it's interesting to note here that you find Rome as sort of a middle point between Western ways of ruling and Eastern ways of ruling. So the East, we're used to it being very despotic, dictators, absolute rule. Think about the autocratic rule of Babylon, Nebuchadnezzar II, the golden head, the power all being in Nebuchadnezzar. You can think of many of the others we've looked at as well, like Assyria, Egypt. The West, you've got more democratic forms of government like Greece. But Rome kind of mixes the two in this form of aristocracy. You've got the rule of a few, but not one single great leader. And it has some sort of popular democratic characteristics, like a senate. And I think maybe, and we can talk about it later, but it could be another reason why we see the reduced level of metal iron rather than gold. And I know there's different opinions on that. And why its successors go on to be this combination of clay and iron. There's always something a little bit democratic in the mix, something not quite as strong in the mix. And it's the Republican period where most of the territory that Rome would rule over was acquired. We think of the Roman Empire. They must have been the ones to create this great empire, the emperors themselves. But actually, the empire grows most, according to Gibbon, in the period of the Republic. And according to him as well, their plan was to continue until Rome literally filled the entire earth. So these Republicans aren't sort of your nice, relaxed, democratic people. They literally want to rule the entire world, and they just assume we're going to keep expanding, we're going to keep having military conquest until every single part of the world is Roman. So their ambitions were absolutely and truly limitless. It was a period of extreme territorial growth. I'll show you it on this map. Hopefully it works. So in the red, that's the Roman Republic. Look how much it grows just in the time of the Roman Republic. So they've got the Italian peninsula going beyond. They've got like the Punic Wars taking North Africa into the Middle East. And only then does it become the empire, when it goes purple. So most of the empire, what we know as the Roman Empire today, is actually established during the Republican period. It grows most in that time. And the empire really is just quite stable. It sort of remains as it is. Obviously, you can see what's going to happen next, but we'll come back to that shortly. The Roman Republic itself would collapse, of course. It would collapse in civil war until Augustus Caesar would restore order with the creation of an empire. And although the empire didn't expand much, as we've just said, it would be the most successful and it would be the most prosperous era in the history of Rome, before and after. And we often compare it, don't we, with the white horse in Revelation 6, the first seal. And Rome was so dominant in this period that in Revelation we see it referred to as the earth. It's the entire earth is Rome. because most of the known world at this time was ruled by Rome, and it encompassed much of the world's population, as much as 1/4. Compare that to countries like India or China. They don't even have that much territory, or at least rule over that much population, I should say, rather than territory. They rule over less a percentage than Rome did then. So it really is the world. And you have to realise what part of the world they're ruling over. They are ruling over the part of the world where all these culturally and economically important parts are, these ancient civilizations, these great civilizations of Egypt, Assyria, Babylon, Greece. So it's almost the most important part of the world that they are ruling over. And it's in the late Republic, the early empire, that Rome comes into contact with another ancient civilization, and that's Judah, Israel. And their initial meeting we find referred to in Daniel 11. If you turn with me now to Daniel chapter 11, we can find about the meeting of these two diametrically opposed cultures. So Daniel 11 is a pretty complex chapter itself, but it's in the context of these two Greek kingdoms which are battling it out between themselves before Rome comes onto the scene. You've got the Ptolemaic and the Seleucid kingdoms, north and south, king of the north, king of the south, and they're fighting against each other. But if you go into verse 14 of Daniel 11, we get the first sign of a new power starting to rise. And this, we would say, is the power of Rome, which is starting to push its way eastward into the territories of the Greek kingdoms. We're told here in verse 14 about the robbers of thy people. And we'd say thy people there is the Jews. And robbers of thy people is a very accurate description of Rome. As we've said, it would go on to completely destroy the Jewish nation, destroying its temples and its riches, and scattering its people into a 2,000-year exile, truly robbing God's people of their wealth, their land, and their hope. And we read that these robbers, if we go on further, will also exalt themselves to establish the vision, meaning that they will fulfill their role in Daniel's vision to weaken and scatter the Jewish nation and become a great power themselves. But we'll see ultimately in the end of verse 14 that they will fall. The Roman Empire would ultimately, in its initial form, fall. Its successor states would fall, and also the Roman Catholic Church, we believe, will fall at Christ's return. Another reference we get of Rome is slightly later, and it's a really interesting one we find later in the chapter, which refers to the first meeting between the Jewish people and Rome. And it's in verse 30. We read here about a power called the ships of Kittim, or Kittim. In the exact context, we understand this perhaps to be a reference to the Roman delegations which headed from Kittim, today known as Cyprus, where the Jews first encountered Roman officials. And the term Kittim, after that point, was used by many Jewish people to describe Rome after they'd taken over Judea. So if you read some of the Dead Sea Scrolls, if you read some of the texts of the Essene community, they refer to Rome as Kittim. They talk about the need to destroy Kittim. And so it's almost like a code word. When you have sort of these underground movements, dissident movements, they'll usually use code language to talk about their oppressors or to talk about the government. And they use this kind of language, these sort of code words to describe the Romans. They refer to them as Kittim. So this is this initial meeting. And of course, the Romans and the Jews would have a very difficult relationship. The Jews would make up a huge percentage of the population of the empire. They'd make up, it doesn't sound much, but it's a huge amount, it's in the millions. They make up about 6 to 9% of the overall population. And in the eastern provinces, and this really amazed me, they made up to 20% of the population. That's a huge amount. That really is quite astonishing. Compare that to the Jewish population of America today. We know that the Jews in America are very influential and successful. And they are only 2.4% of the population of America. Compare that to 6 to 9% or even 20% in the eastern provinces of the Roman Empire. So if the American Jews have such a massive influence on American culture, American life, then think about the influence that they could have on the Roman way of life as well, and the Roman Empire. We're talking about millions of people, remember, millions of Jewish people. And they lived not just in Judea, but widely around the Roman Empire, with very large communities in Alexandria, Cyrene, and Rome itself. There was a big Jewish community. So it's not just in Judah that we see the Jews. Now, in a sense, the Jews would never quite fit into the Roman Empire. The Romans found it very hard to understand the Jewish way of life. And I'm going to quote you an account of sort of the Roman view of the Jews. So this is from Tacitus' Histories, and he's writing basically the official Roman view in that sense of the Jews. And he's very scathing towards them, very hateful towards them. And he says, talking about them, I'm going to read part of it. Part of it won't be on there, part of it will, so you can somewhat follow along. So he says about the Jewish religion, Moses, wishing to secure for the future his authority over the nation, gave them a novel form of worship, a new form, opposed to all that's practiced by other men. Things sacred with us, with them have no sanctity. Well, they allow what with us is forbidden. So we're complete opposites, he's saying. The Romans are over here and the Jews are over here, completely different. This worship, however introduced, is upheld by its antiquity, by its practices in the past. And he says they are once perverse and disgusting, and they owe their strength to their very badness. The most degraded out of other races, scorning their national beliefs, these are Gentile converts, brought to them their contributions and presents. This augmented changed the wealth of the Jews, as also did the fact that among themselves they are inflexibly honest and ever ready to show compassion, though they regard the rest of mankind with all the hatred of enemies. And he talks about all the things they do differently, and how circumcision was adopted by them as a mark of difference from other men. They want to separate themselves. Why won't they join with us, with our Roman way of life, with our universal way of life? Those who come over to their religion adopt the practice and have this lesson instilled to them to despise all gods, to disown their own country, to set at naught parents, children, and brethren. And still they provide for the increase of their numbers. And he talks again about many of the differences between them, how they don't bury, that they bury rather than burn their dead, very different from Rome in some cases. Quite different as well, he says, is their faith about things divine. The Egyptians worship many animals and images of monstrous form, but the Jews have purely mental conceptions of deity as one in essence. They call those profane who make representations of God in human shape out of perishable materials. They believe that being to be supreme and eternal, neither capable of representation nor of decay. So he's saying, again, they've got this weird belief about God. God is not this image. God is not this almost physical thing. He's like this mental construct, and that's bizarre to the Romans. They can't understand. And he goes on to say, they therefore do not allow any images to stand in their cities, much less in their temples. And this flattery is not paid to their kings, nor this honour to our emperors. So they're rejecting the empire and the ways of doing things in Rome. And then he goes to try and make this comparison to other sort of cults of the area. So he says, from the fact, however, that the priests used to chant to the music of flutes and cymbals and to wear garlands of ivy, and that a golden vine was found in the temple, some have thought that they worshipped Father Liber, the conqueror of the East, though their institutions do not by any means harmonise with the theory. For Liber established a festive and cheerful worship, while the Jewish religion is tasteless and mean. So he really does not like the Jewish people, and this is quite emblematic of many of the Roman attitudes towards the Jews of the time. So there were huge differences between the Jewish and Roman worlds, and the Romans were often shocked and offended by a Jewish way of life. You know, the Romans were used to tolerating other religions in return for mutual respect, but the Jewish religion didn't tolerate other faiths. It denied them altogether, insisted that their God, invisible and all-powerful, was superior and was the only one to be worshipped. The Romans were also, as you can see, and we've said before, very cosmopolitan. They wanted all nations and peoples of the world to slowly merge their cultures in and under one universal Roman culture. much like the spirit of the Tower of Babel. Jews, by contrast, are kind of sometimes referred to as the first nationalists. They believed in one separate way of life, one separate law, separate territory to be settled exclusively by them. Many of the people of the Roman Empire resented then having to cater for the Jews' special and separate needs wherever they lived. And it would cause huge problems in cities like Alexandria, where the Jews were very populous. And there were often riots and disputes over the Jews' apparent privileges. You can see where the Jews were popular, where they lived across the empire. And I think sometimes it's quite comparable to the issue of Islam in the West today. It's sort of a group which won't quite fit in with the cosmopolitan society around it, and there's clashes there, there's problems, and I think the Jews are very much the sort of Islam issue of their time within the Roman Empire. And there were many Jewish uprisings happening against Rome, not just in Judah, but also in parts of the empire where there were large Jewish populations. During the Kitos Wars, 115 AD, Jewish populations would occupy massive parts of Roman territory, a good chunk of North Africa. They tried to create an independent state in Cyrenaica and Alexandria, even establishing this little mini Jewish kingdom there for a bit. So there were a lot of problems that they were causing for the Romans, and the Romans then did not view them with favour at all in any way. How did Jewish society sort of react to Roman rule? So obviously there's a lot of negative reactions, but there's also some sort of positives. Some parts of Jewish society would cooperate heavily, like the Sadducees. They were often quite adaptive towards sort of the Greek ways of life. They were quite happy to go along with some of those aspects. Others would walk a kind of middle line, like the Pharisees, trying to please the Jewish people and also trying to sort of stay in official acceptance by the Romans. And then obviously the Zealots would be completely opposed to Rome and would try and overthrow the empire entirely, or at least get them out of Judah. Of course, as established though, the Jewish world was in a collision course with Rome right from the start, and the Jewish nation would ultimately be hijacked by the extremist Zealot faction, who were determined to have this military confrontation with Rome. They believed they could bring about the Messiah by themselves, which is often a mistake that the Jewish people have come across, including in, when Israel was being established, some of them were saying, this is us creating our own Messiah. Obviously, that's not true. And this attempt to remove Rome would end in disaster, fulfilling the words of Deuteronomy, many of the other prophecies, including the words of Jesus himself in the Olivet prophecy, as AD 70 occurred and Rome destroyed the temple, scattering the Jewish people abroad or killing them altogether. And in this, Rome would then confirm its role as the robbers of thy people, established in Daniel chapter 11. And there'd only be more conflicts after that between the Jews and Rome. In, as I said, the Kitos Wars, other Jewish uprisings, Bar Kokhba uprising as well, even later. And after this point then, and you'll notice that Christians are also shown on here. After this point, Christians become the new enemy. So the Jews have kind of been crushed, and there's now a new threat to Rome, to stability in Rome. In the Gospels, Rome is obviously presented as a oppressive power, but there's not sort of a strong or direct condemnation of Rome. Jesus tells people to pay their taxes to Caesar. He refuses to join the Zealots in encouraging military resistance. And Pilate even speaks for Jesus, condemning him less harshly than the Jewish rulers themselves. But after AD 70, Rome starts to view the Christians as the ultimate enemy within, rather than the Jews. In any sort of dictatorship, there's always the enemy within that needs to be handled. And in this period in Rome, we're sort of coming towards the end of this white horse period, this period where everything's going well for Rome, everything's successful. And when people are in chaos, when people are facing instability, they always look for something, don't they? What do they always look for? They always look for a scapegoat. They always look for someone to blame for their problems. And for them, the Christians became that problem. They became the new threat to the stability of the empire for them, and certainly someone to blame. And the Roman population had become more and more fascinated by monotheism. Initially they were very interested in the Jewish religion because of its monotheism. It's a very big difference from the other religions of the time. Zoroastrianism is probably the closest you can get with sort of a dualistic conception of God, but this is the sort of most major monotheistic religion in the area. And so a lot of people were attracted to the Jewish religion. I saw one incredible statistic once which showed that as much as 50%, or getting close to 50% of the Jewish community outside of Judea were converts, which is incredible. It was obviously having a massive amount of appeal. And you can see that Tacitus, in that sort of quote that I put there, he constantly refers to these converts, people who are giving up their own gods, their own nations to join the Jews. So there was a lot of interest in this worship of one God. But when Paul spread Christianity abroad, these sort of monotheistic Gentiles switched their interest to Christianity and converted in even higher numbers than those who had converted to Judaism. So at that point, Christianity really becomes this new threat. The Jews have been crushed, their resistance has ended, their influence is gone, and this new disrupting religion emerges. And believers then are forced to adopt a defensive and quite critical position towards Rome. And it becomes customary amongst believers to refer to the persecuting authorities as Babylon. We see this in 1 Peter 5, verse 13. You don't have to turn that. But 1 Peter 5, verse 13, he talks about the ecclesia that is at Babylon, elected together with you, saluteth you. And again, it's this sort of underground movement, dissident movement. Christianity is using sort of tactics of a dissident movement, having to refer to their oppressors by a sort of code name, calling them Babylon, because obviously this isn't an ecclesia in Babylon itself, we think this is referring to ecclesia in Rome. And comparing Rome to Babylon continues, doesn't it, in the New Testament, in Revelation. We learnt that in Lawrence's talk. There's obvious comparisons between the two, between Rome and Babylon. Rome and Babylon were both persecutors of God's people, Jews and early believers. They were both capitals of an empire with ambitions for world supremacy. And they were both centres of pagan belief. But eventually, the persecution would end for the Christians. There would be some harsh and violent persecution, but it would end with the rise of Constantine. He famously sees this symbol in the sky, the cross or the name of Jesus, and he's told, in this sign conquer. And from then on, apparently, allegedly, he comes to become a great Christian believer. And so he inaugurates then that final stage of Rome, the final stage of the Roman Empire, Christian Rome. But it's not a true Christian Rome. It is an apostate Christian Rome. And he would distort the faith of Jesus into a new religion, Roman Christianity, their own brand of Christianity, and they'd worship a new God, ultimately, the Trinity. If we turn to Daniel 11, I think we're already in there actually, but if we go back there, if we have moved, to Daniel 11, verse 36, we see this Christian Rome being described. So verse 36, it's a big chapter, but going on to verse 36, we're following the rise of this king. You don't have the king of the south anymore, you don't have the king of the north, it's only the king. And this king must be the ruler of the whole territory surrounding Israel to the north and south. And it describes the Roman Empire, which would rule over Israel, ruled over the north and south of Israel after the Greek kingdoms. And this is now a new Rome in verse 37, which will not regard the God of his fathers, nor the desire of women, nor the regard of any god, for he shall magnify himself above all. And this is referring what Rome will ultimately become. The one established by Constantine, a Rome which no longer acknowledged the pagan gods of its forefathers. It's referring to this Roman Christianity, this Roman church. And we see that the king will instead honour a God whom his fathers knew not, the new Trinitarian God of Christian Rome. And you see further characteristics of this form of Rome, the Christian Rome. Later on, we talk about the king honouring the God with gold and silver and precious stones and pleasant things. You think of the great palaces, the great temples and cathedrals associated with Roman Christianity. And you see many other factors which identify this Rome. Verse 36, the king will do according to his will. He will exalt himself and magnify himself above every god, and will speak marvellous things against the God of gods. The Pope, the head of the Roman Church, would go on to declare himself as the God on earth, the vicar of Christ, one in the place of Christ, or in their view, one in the place of God. Truly the God on earth, much like the Roman emperors of the past. So, going back to Constantine, he would move the capital of the empire from Rome to the new city of Constantinople, named after himself, in the east. And it would become the centre of the military of the Roman Empire and its political administration. And so from this point on, we've really come to associate the military aspect of the empire and this eastern segment with that dragon power, which we read about much later in Revelation in chapter 12. After Constantine, the empire would divide into two. Now, it had been divided for purposes of administration a bit earlier by Diocletian, but they'd only become truly separate empires in 395 AD. And that's when we can really talk about the legs forming, the west and the east, the legs of Nebuchadnezzar's image. And so you see that split there. Rome is the capital of the Western Roman Empire in red, and then Constantinople, the ruler, or the capital of the Eastern Roman Empire in purple, sometimes known as the Byzantine Empire to history. So ultimately we find, and you can see from some of these images, that the Western Roman Empire would fall. So the red would disappear, and you'd only be left with the purple. It would fall to barbarian invasion in the late 400s AD. But the East would carry on, and it would carry on for a very long time, for about 1,000 years afterwards. We often don't talk about it. But it would carry on, and it would carry on as a seat of the Roman Empire. Yeah. It didn't regard itself as the Eastern Roman Empire. It didn't regard itself as the Byzantine Empire. It regarded itself as the Roman Empire. That's what it called itself. So the Roman Emperor continues on in the East. So what happens in the West? Well, in the West, the Roman Empire, again, would continue on in a different form. And it would continue in the form of the Bishop of Rome, the Pope, who would lead the Roman Church. And the Roman Church would preserve the language, it would preserve the culture of Rome itself. And like Rome, it would claim supremacy over the world. You can see that in the name, Catholic, universal, just like the Romans were universal. Everything to be in us. And the Pope himself claimed the office of the Roman Emperor. He used the title Pontifex Maximus. The Pope still uses it today. It's his Twitter handle, or X handle, whatever it's called now. And this was the title, Pontifex Maximus, used by the Roman emperors, relating to the title of the high priest of the Roman religion, the Roman pagan religion. But what an unusual title to claim for a allegedly Christian leader. He'd also claimed to be the ruler of the world, as we said, like the Roman emperors would. And then he claims millions of titles, doesn't he? His Holiness, the Holy Father, Bishop of Rome, successor to St. Peter, Patriarch of the West, Prince of the Apostles. And the one which stands out for me is Vicar of Christ. Like we said earlier, vicar means to be in the place of. If you're in the place of Christ, and if you believe that Christ is God, then you are in the place of God. What is this saying, other than that the Pope is in the place of God and has his authority on the earth? Exactly, again, what the Roman emperors would claim to be gods, to be rulers of the earth. And just like 2 Thessalonians 2, the man of sin who exalts himself above everything that is called God. And we see the church, the Catholic Church, still making these claims today, don't we? For universal rule. They don't say it explicitly, but they engage in governments. They try and influence other governments. They're influencing the European Union, United Nations, all these different forces. So they still very much regard themselves as the rightful rulers of the earth. There's this quote that they used back in the medieval time, saying that he hath all power on earth, all temporal power is his, the dominion, jurisdiction, and government of the whole earth is his by divine right. And the power of the Pope would only continue to increase over the following centuries. Justinian, at one point, would restore his power. In 602 AD, Focus would declare the Bishop of Rome to have preeminence, and the Pope would gain temporal rulership. He would rule over actual states. We think of that as strange today, with only the Vatican City, a very small amount of territory. Smallest country in the world, I think. But he's ruling over 3 massive states in Italy. And it would continue the persecution that the Roman Empire was carrying out against God's people, both the natural Israel, the Jewish people, and spiritual Israel, the true believers. The Pope would persecute those people. The Roman Church would persecute Israel, spiritual and natural. And there was also the attempted restoration of the West, the Western Roman Emperor, with the Pope now as its leader in the form of the Holy Roman Empire. And starting with Charlemagne, the Pope would become the one to appoint the Holy Roman Emperor, ruling alongside the Emperor in this sort of dual rulership. And we find this described in Revelation 13, verse 11, when talking about the beasts of the earth. We read Revelation 13, verse 11. I beheld another beast coming out of the earth. He had 2 horns like a lamb, and he spake as a dragon. Of course, horns refer to rulers, don't they? And in this case, we see that these 2 rulers are the Pope and the Emperor, this dual leadership. And the dragon quality of this lamb represents the Roman nature of this empire, the Roman influence which is still there. Again, also important to note, the Holy Roman Empire doesn't regard itself as the Holy Roman Empire. It doesn't call itself that. That's what historians call it. It calls itself the Roman Empire and often just refers to itself as the Empire, because it's making that universal claim. Okay, and often the Pope would extend his power in the Holy Roman Empire above that of the actual emperor, the one who's meant to be ruling politically. There's cases where the actual emperor, the Holy Roman Emperor himself, would try and sort of rebel against the Pope, and he'd be brought to heel. There's one case where he has to actually come to the Pope in Rome, and he has to sort of kneel before him, prostrate before him, until he's restored his power to him. So the Pope really is ruling and really is becoming the successor to the Roman emperors of the past in that sense. Now, the Holy Roman Empire would decline over time. It would become almost ridiculous. It would become so disjointed and ununified. It becomes sort of a mockery in that sense, to the point where it would just almost fade away, and Napoleon would destroy it in 1806. But we see today attempts to revive this Western Roman Empire in the form of the European Union. Again, the Catholic Church is heavily involved in this, trying to have a very formal role in the governance of the Union. The European Union itself comes into being in the form of the Treaty of Rome. So we're seeing perhaps a modern day equivalent or fulfillment of this today. Quickly then, what about the East? We need to think about what's going on in the East, because we kind of left the East behind, and just focus on the West. But the East continues as well, even afterwards. So it continues for about 1,000 years, as we said, after the collapse of the Western Empire, only being destroyed by the Ottomans, the Muslim Empire, in 1453. But there is a sense in which this empire would continue in the East. Russia would claim to be the inheritors of the Eastern Empire, the Byzantine Empire, calling itself the Third Rome. And this is a fact not really known that much outside Russia itself, but it is quite well known in Russia, especially amongst Orthodox faithful, that it regards itself as the Third Rome. And it's even been referred to very recently in Russian TV. I was going to paste a clip of it, actually. Maybe I'll show it to you later. And Russia would claim this inheritance. It would say the first Rome was Rome itself, the second Rome is Constantinople, and the third Rome is Moscow. And it would justify this by showing how it was a fellow Orthodox Christian nation, just like Byzantine Empire had been, just like the Eastern Roman Empire had been. It would call itself, of course, the third Rome. It would tie itself even further to the Eastern Roman Empire and its imperial throne through the marriage of the Eastern Empire princess, Sophia, to the Russian Tsar. So they're actually becoming part of the royal family of Russia. And that title, Tsar, you probably heard the rulers of Russia call themselves Tsars. That means Caesar. It's the Russian for Caesar. Again, continuing the idea of the Roman Empire. And after this marriage, this intertwining of the Russian throne with the Eastern Roman Empire throne, we saw the adoption of a special symbol. And that symbol is the double-headed eagle. Double-headed eagle was used by the Byzantine Empire, and it was then adopted by Russia. Of course, for a period of about 70 years, that disappeared. We didn't see that anymore because we had the Soviet Union. You had the hammer and the sickle instead. And when Russia was reborn as the Russian Federation, there was a discussion of what to do. Should we have a bear as the symbol? Should we have some other kind of symbol, some new symbol to represent Russia? But they decided, no, we'll have that old symbol, the Byzantine symbol of the double-headed eagle. And there's a lot of significance in that eagle, which we can talk about later, perhaps. And so that is now on all the symbols of Russia. You can see it on some of their tanks, on their artillery that they're using going into Ukraine today, again attempting to expand the empire. And we expect then, ultimately Russia, and Russia's been saying this for a very long time, to come down and to take Constantinople and to place its new capital in Constantinople, fully re-establishing the Eastern Empire, because at the moment they're not there. They may spiritually be there, but they're not there physically, and they are going to come down, and we expect them to attack Turkey before they invade Israel and take that and occupy that to fulfill their role as this latter-day Roman Empire, this world empire. Coming towards the end, but I just wanted to show you this and think about this question of who would be the ruler of the Roman Empire today. If you had to choose, who would it be? There's this excellent video which I highly recommend on YouTube, and it's called Who Has the Best Claim to the Title of Roman Emperor, of people who are living today. And it goes through a number of different candidates. I think the weakest is Jean-Christophe Napoleon, who is a descendant of Napoleon himself, because he sort of usurped the Holy Roman Empire. Karl von Habsburg, descendant of the Austrian rulers of the Holy Roman Empire. King Philippe of Spain. His family, the Spanish royal family, were given the rights to Constantinople and Byzantine Empire when it collapsed by the then ruler. Ali Osman, who I believe is one of the descendants of the caliphs of the Ottoman Empire. They were ruling over Constantinople, so maybe he has a claim. And then finally you've got Andrew Romanov. I'm not sure if he's still alive, because this was a few years ago and he looks quite old. But the Romanov family, in some extent, obviously being Tsars of Russia. And it's a really interesting video to watch. But he really concludes, and he says, the ones to rule the future Roman Empire, if it was re-established, it would be the strongest. Just like how Rome was first established. You know, it was established in violence. It was established by whoever had the greatest power and force. And he says, you'll see that kind of again. And I'd say, of the candidates, that it's the Russian claim that's looking the most violent right now. That's the one which is looking most aggressive, that has the desire to do these things, which it's saying it's going to do. And so, yes, we've got the Roman Catholic Church, we've got the European Union, and we've also got then the Russians and this new Russian empire that Putin desires and wants to construct. And the reunification of the Roman Empire then we can only see when these two legs will join together, these two parts. The Russian East unifying with the European West. And we suggest that this will be the image empire of the latter days, when it will stand on its feet, this whole image of all these empires, ruling over all the territories of the empires we've looked at, and it will stand on its feet, and it will attack God's people, only to be destroyed, of course, by the stone in the form of Jesus and the saints. And that's the day we look forward to, when all that pride and that might of Rome is destroyed and abolished. And to quote Revelation, and the seventh angel sounded, and the great voices in heaven saying, and this is what we look forward to, the kingdoms of this world, the Roman world, are become the kingdoms of our Lord and of his Christ, and he shall reign forever and ever. Thank you.